what we're facing now is not only the realization that we need to plan for providing clinical services and allied services to South Africa for infectious diseases issues in general, but also for, in the light of the COVID pandemic, what that has shown us about the need for leadership in infectious diseases and programs related to infection, and of course, outbreaks and future pandemics. So I think it's an important time to rediscuss this issue and just thanking and being mindful of the amazing work that our founding fathers and mothers did in 2005, and Lucille is on the call. But also, very importantly, I know that Gary Martins and Mark Cotton and a number of other people were also instrumental in ensuring that infectious diseases actually became an accredited or a recognized subspecialty in South Africa, and that really launched our subspecialty in South Africa. And now we need to step back and just look at where we are now and think about how we could take this forward. Just some housekeeping issues. What we're going to do is we're going to have our 5 panelists give some short views. And I would ask everybody, it's really difficult for me to concentrate and try and chair this and have to mute everybody all the time. So please, if you're not speaking, could you mute yourselves? And then we're going to have a bit of a panel discussion and open it out for others to chip in. So without further ado, our first speaker is going to be Dr. Halima Dawood from Pietermaritzburg, and it's wonderful that you could join us, Halima, and I have shared the screen sharing facility so we can see it now. And Halima is going to give us a sort of situational analysis around adult infectious diseases in South Africa. So over to you, Halima.
Thank you, Mark, and good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for attending this meeting. But I also like to say thank you to Mark for putting this meeting together to give us an opportunity to reflect and sort of get some idea as we move forward. And also to thank everybody working under very challenging circumstances in COVID for all the hard work that everybody's put into the management of COVID-19 in the country. So I was tasked with looking at the state of ID currently in the nation. And this is briefly the outline under which I will discuss it. So in September 2019, Mark, together with Tom Boyles and others, wrote a piece in the South African Medical Journal, essentially looking at the progress made in the subspecialty of infectious diseases. And also there's this very nice table in that correspondence looking at the training post per subspecialist across the different provinces and then per subspecialty. And what's important to note is at that time, which is 2019, whilst we had 4 provinces had ID specialists, there were different numbers in proportions, but the 5 provinces had ID specialists, but the 4 provinces didn't have any ID specialists. But if you look at it across the subspecialty, it's common amongst all subspecialties except for cardiology, which both in pediatric and adult medicine has made some progress in attracting or training specialists for the other provinces. And at that stage, the Western Cape had the most number of ID specialists, followed by Gauteng province. So when we look at the current posts, training posts at training centers as of this week, in South Africa, when you look at the Western provinces, there are 3 full-time ID subspecialists and 3 working either in research or elsewhere. They have 12 training numbers, which is the greatest number of training numbers in the country, and currently 1 trainee. Stellenbosch has 2 full-time posts and 1 person working in general medicine that's also an ID specialist, has 3 training numbers and currently 1 trainee in training. In KwaZulu-Natal, we have 3 ID specialists in the public sector, of which, and then we have 1 in Pietermaritzburg, 1 in Durban, and 2 in Pietermaritzburg, 1 in Durban, 4 trainee numbers, 2 in Durban, 2 in Pietermaritzburg, and currently 1 trainee. The Eastern Cape has had significant challenges. They've got 1 trainee post, which is unfilled, 2 specialists between Port Elizabeth and East London, and I believe Tom Boyles is spending some time currently, so that's the +1. So the permanent posts are 2 ID subspecialists. Gauteng has 7 subspecialists. The GF here means grandfather, so 2 were under the grandfather clause. 1 is currently based in research. 8 trainee numbers, of which 3 are full. So currently they have the highest number of trainees in the country. And then the University of Pretoria currently has no ID specialists. They're not yet accredited for training and no trainees. Tanji Manzini is now based in Medunsa. So she's the subspecialist at Medunsa, currently in the process of putting together her training program. The only aspect that's outstanding is the virologist. And this reflects the challenges in setting up an ID training program, that you need to also have other subspecialists, other specialities on board, like microbiology and virology, or else there's going to be a commute to get to that training. So that training center will be set up, I think, in the next year, if everything goes well in terms of accessing virology training. In the Free State, there are 3 full-time posts, currently with 1 training number, and that post is full. So in total, in the country currently, we have 20% of our trainee posts filled and people training at the moment, but we have a lot of training numbers. What I was unclear is about how many of those training numbers have a post assigned to it. Because when we look at the KZN experience, while we have 4 training numbers, we have only 2 posts, and those posts are intermittently frozen. And so they only release at different times. So by example, my post is currently frozen, trying to unfreeze it, but with the recent application, they released the nephrology and the cardiology post, but not the infectious diseases post. So those are some of the challenges in terms of training, in that you may have the training numbers, but you don't necessarily have the post associated with the training numbers. In terms of training between centers, the NICD special pathogens course has a significant contribution to training, and we just recently had our course for this year. And then at the last time we got together discussing training, we had discussed sort of different training centers contributing to training around the country. And Jeremy had very kindly offered his WITS ID seminars, which were started this year. And I think currently we've exceeded the number of people that could join the Zoom meeting. So Jeremy has now extended the number of participants by getting some help from the South African HIV Clinician Society's Zoom platform. Nilesh has also started mycology rounds, which he extends the invitation to everybody on the FITSA membership. And then UCT has the ECHO COVID seminars that are very well attended. And then more recently, I've attended a few of the journal clubs hosted by Mark and his unit. So I think what's developed in the recent times, especially in light of Zoom availability and access, is the training between centers has expanded more recently. And finally, in terms of the training curriculum, we have in 2019, we had revised the syllabus and logbook, and it was submitted in 2020 to the college. We haven't had any feedback yet, but I'm sure we should be on the agenda at this coming up college meeting. In terms of the examinations, we've had to modify the examinations due to COVID restrictions. So the oral exams are now conducted over Zoom. I'm sure it's somewhat of a challenge in that the interaction is somewhat distant. And then the OSCE had to be modified to be conducted as a computer-based OSCE, and the responses are recorded on Google Forms, and the written has remained unchanged. So far, that's my sort of state of the ID in South Africa currently. Just to say that we also have the case of the month, which is a CPD accredited case of the month that all the centers contribute to, and we now have the offer to publish the best case of the month in the journal. So that's an incentive to contribute to the case of the month. So thank you, Mark. I can take questions or we can wait until
the end. Fantastic, Halima. Thanks very much. We're not going to take questions right now. We're going to go through the talks and then we're going to have a discussion. Again, can just everybody make sure they remain muted. So thank you. So 4 out of the 9 provinces remain without any ID subspecialist, adult ID subspecialist. And only 2 of the units actually have a relatively full quota of 3 subspecialists. So challenges there and food for thought. So Jeremy Nell, I'm very pleased to welcome Jeremy as the president-elect. I should have said that Halima is the president of IDSA, and Jeremy is the president-elect and the head of infectious diseases at WITS. So from a public sector viewpoint, Jeremy, thanks.
Thanks very much. Thanks, Mark. And thanks again, just echoing Halima for putting this together. Really, really timely meeting and a good place to kick it off, I think, this discussion. I think, I mean, the view in terms of the future, I think we have to acknowledge one big concern, which is local, but is also international, and it has to be put in the right setting. And that's really that we don't have enough people, and we don't have enough people locally, but it is not just a problem of funding and the recognition in South Africa. This is a problem across the world. I managed to get some data from the US, which just last year, for example, suggests about just short of a quarter, about between 1/5 and a quarter of people couldn't fill, 21% of the posts weren't filled basically in terms of ID within the US. That compares to something less than 1% in terms of oncology, less than 0.1% in terms of cardiology. It's a well-established problem there. When they have done quite a lot of research in the US to look at what might be the cause there. And indeed, they've done similar research in the UK as well. And the number one thing that comes up in the US, at least, is salary. Now, they do have a very strange system, which is not transferable necessarily here, whereby, for example, if you were to specialize or subspecialize with infectious diseases, you may actually earn less than if you hadn't subspecialized and you were just practicing as a hospitalist, as they call them there. So there's particular issues in the US, but it is still a feature here, and it is not seen as a particularly lucrative option in private, for example. Obviously, the state sector doesn't have quite that same issue where the salaries are the same, but that is one big factor. But then the state sector's equivalent is it doesn't get the posts that I think it needs to really drive this through. Other reasons given were lack of procedures, which is not entirely true in ID, certainly. We do stuff, but not as much as, for example, the gastroenterologist or cardiologist, and then in some settings not really transferable here. The training length, some of the solutions people have been thinking about for the last decade and more internationally and locally. One big thing that comes through in all the research is that a key factor in deciding in people's minds, in making up their minds to do ID, let's say, was exposure in a very positive sense at an undergraduate level. So it does suggest that improving exposure and improving teaching and the kind of general experience in terms of both ID and microbiology at an undergraduate level actually has real downstream effects that are very positive in terms of getting people to join. And often microbiology is just presented as a list of organisms. I had a look at the ID curriculum at Wits this morning. Thanks to Naisha for showing it to me, and it needs improvement, to say the least. So I think there's definitely things that can be done there. There's other options which South Africa kind of does anyway, which is a sort of a hybrid between microbiology and infectious diseases, which would get people into doing both and choosing at a later stage. But South Africa does do that. You can be an infectious disease specialist via the microbiology route, and then salary support, and then selling the discipline as positive a way as possible. A big issue really is convincing the government and institutions in general to support ID commensurate to its value, not necessarily in terms of the amount it will bring in terms of private sector funding, for example, but things like prevention of complications, prevention of inappropriate antibiotic use, which is more than 20% in many surveys of antibiotics are inappropriately given. And so when you add up those sort of costs, ID is a very cost-effective specialty. In fact, one of the most cost-effective. I've got a stat there about how, for example, the 5 highest ID admissions actually exceed in terms of cost the entire capacity of cardiovascular disease in the US, which is quite something considering how much cardiovascular disease they have. And the DOH, I think, needs to have a better handle on really the crucial role that ID does play in terms of antimicrobial stewardship, cost containment. HIV and TB is entirely run really by ID at the top level, although it's obviously devolved down at clinic levels as well. But this is, I mean, if you look at the things that cause disease in South Africa, this is one of the most crucial issues. And for example, hospitals that would pay for an ID post to run the antimicrobial stewardship, for example, is a good model, and not just, for example, tack it on to an already overburdened service. In terms of where it's going internationally, because it may have some relevance to where it goes locally, the 4 big streams in ID in most of the first world is either HIV, which is becoming less and less of a driver because in the integrase inhibitor era, HIV can become quite boring. You end up talking about diabetes and hypertension rather than anything HIV related in the clinics. Antimicrobial stewardship's a big thing. So hospitals have developed entire teams led by infectious disease specialists to run that. So that's a valid sort of career path within ID. Transplant ID is booming in the first world. Again, it's going to have a cap on that in South Africa, but there is certainly a role. And then outpatient antibiotics, which we had a good lecture from last week at UCT, but again, it's not something that's particularly taken off. And then in terms of other things, very briefly in the last issue really to consider, Helima did mention some of this, but I think it would be really good for us all to rethink what it means to have these teaching programs in the Zoom era, because there's a lot of capacity to do things across platform and across hospitals and really across the country and even beyond the country. We have things that we do at the moment, which are attracting people from throughout Africa at the moment. And it would be really good, all the sort of things you do automatically, now that it's on Zoom, could be opened across the country and across really other hospitals as well. And that's something I think we can all think of in our own centers as to what other centers would benefit and where there could be links made. And then the last point is that I want to just make one controversial thing, that I don't think it's the state at the moment is fully capable of training any doctor at a subspecialty level in totality. And what I mean by that is I think that, for example, the training you could get would get you 90% of the way there, but there are things such as new antibiotics, hepatitis C drugs. These are just examples. Some certain immunosuppressants like checkpoint inhibitors, where you really need the exposure to familiarize yourself with the ID aspects. When I practiced in different countries, the surgical procedures were so different. It took a long time for me to get a handle on things like LVADs and things like that. So I do think there's a need as well for us to involve the private sector in some limited capacity, at least in the training. And I think that we can benefit in a really useful way and really push ID up to a world-class standard. And it's pretty good at the moment. The issue really is numbers first and foremost. Thanks, Mark.
No, that's excellent, Jeremy. Thanks very much. I'm sure a lot of the points you made are going to generate questions, and particularly, interesting about the leveraging interest with exposure at undergraduate level, and the importance, as Helima said, of interconnectedness. And then that last issue about potentially the involvement of international colleagues in some of our training with this new interconnectedness. So that's fabulous, a great view from the public sector. And as we move on to a view from the private sector, it's great to welcome Kim, And just to highlight that on this webinar now, we have over twice the number of adult ID subspecialists in the country on the call. So there's clearly interest over and above just who are recognized, people that are recognized as subspecialists, which is also important to think about how people relate to ID. Anyway, over to Kim. Fascinating, and thank you for sharing your views from private, Kim.
Great, thank you for the invitation, and hello to all of you. Thank you, Mark. So in Johannesburg, there are 3 private infectious diseases specialists, two working mainly in infectious diseases and 1, I believe, doing mainly general medicine. In Pretoria, we don't have any private infectious diseases specialists. There was a general physician who'd done time with Prof. Stoltz, but did not complete exams. And from what I understand, he's working as a general physician and mainly in ICU as well. Bloemfontein has got no private infectious diseases specialists. One of the consultants that works in the public sector does antibiotic stewardship rounds for one of the private hospitals. But again, this is really on a sessional RWAPS basis and not very regular. In KZN, there are 2 private infectious diseases specialists. One is in Port Shepstone, and then there's another microbiologist who's got an FCP who's working as an ID specialist. It's also my understanding that both of these work as general physicians as well as infectious disease specialists. In Cape Town, there are 5 doctors that work in private. Most of them do general medicine as well. One of them is mainly in state and works and does sessions and RWAPs as well. And I think only 1 or 2 of the private doctors in Cape Town does pure infectious diseases. So basically the bottom line is that the majority of us working in private and doing infectious diseases do some general medicine. So the scope of infectious diseases in private, like it is in state, is absolutely massive. And we do have some benefits, being the access to more immunosuppressive drugs and greater numbers of transplants being done in the private sector. And so with multiple hematology oncology centers across the country and the transplant centers, there's potentially massive amounts of work for an infectious diseases specialist, or at least input from us. There's also far more ICU beds in the private sector. And along with that goes a lot of nosocomial infection. And so antibiotic stewardship and advice for these patients also requires an infectious disease specialist. I think that the scope for travel medicine is potentially higher in private, although it should be just as high in state, with lots of people coming to work in South Africa from north of us. But maybe the more affluent travel medicine or people returning home who are on medical aids and have been working in countries and bringing in infections. Certainly we make some interesting diagnoses. Along with state, the osteomyelitis prosthetic joint infection is a massive problem, and potentially we see more of these patients because we probably get more people having prosthetic joints inserted compared to areas in the state. Antibiotic stewardship rounds and infection control just as massive, if not more, and need more input. And then the need for complicated management of patients with HIV and TB is also huge in private, with GPs managing the vast majority of these patients and really not knowing where to turn to when things are going badly. And despite all of this, I think most importantly for an infectious diseases specialist in private is also the support and help in academic and teaching facilities in terms of teaching not just fellows, but medical students, registrars, helping out with clinical rounds, helping out with all the courses that we run throughout the year. I'm thinking of the special pathogens course, the diplomas that are run, etc. So having a collaboration between private and public infectious diseases. So the limitations to private work are the same, I think, as in state. There's far too few private infectious diseases specialists. Like in state, the value of infectious diseases is extremely undermined and undervalued, where general physicians and doctors in general feel that they know enough and can manage their own infectious diseases and so don't refer. And where an infectious diseases specialist would be able to make a huge difference in private is often in no man's land, and we're not able to generate any money from doing this because hospital groups don't want to pay for it, and because one's not really able to bill patients at the moment for things like infection prevention control measures, for antibiotic stewardship rounds. And so it's really become something which people don't want to get involved with because lots and lots and lots of time is spent with really no compensation at all. The hospital groups are starting to understand the value of an infectious diseases specialist and trying to prepare for this, to not just have my experience, but I chatted with some of the other ID guys that are in private, and some of them are starting to be compensated for doing antibiotic rounds, for doing and helping out with infection control measures. And in the last year, specifically Netcare, and I think the other hospital groups have helped and used the ID specialists in private to help with the COVID pandemic in terms of protocols, in terms of outbreak investigation and management, and have compensated and seen the value of us there. So we know that we would be massively beneficial in all of these. And like the previous speakers have said, in drawing up protocols for the hospitals, massive amounts of cost cutting, we would be able to help them with that, fewer complications with the patients, all these things we know already, but the hospital groups aren't prepared to pay for it. So what we really need is for them to implement expectation legislation so that decisions or suggestions which are made on, for instance, antimicrobial rounds, stewardship rounds, that we would be able to implement those and change or stop other doctors' antibiotics. And as you know, at the moment, if it's a specific person's patient, one is not allowed to just go up and stop the antibiotic, even when you know that it's completely wrong and there's something better. So they need to institute clinical governance rules, and this will require changes in the private hospitals' rules and enforcement, and really investing in us and saying that if they would like us to do these kind of things, we need to be effective, and by doing that, we need to be able to change prescriptions, give advice which is taken and not just said thank you and ignored. There's also medical aid limitations, and this is extremely frustrating because anything out of the ordinary, anything that's not first-line ARVs, first-line TB treatment, needs to be motivated for by the doctor. Obviously, that makes sense, but then these decisions are governed by medical officers and nurses on the other end of the line in the medical aid. And they really don't understand what we're trying to do, why we're using drugs, don't read through the motivation properly, and it causes massive delays in accessing medicine. And the kind of things where we really have problems are alternative drug regimens for patients with DILIs, non-tuberculous mycobacterial infections, for instance, unusual infections which require prolonged antibiotics, expensive antibiotics or unusual antibiotics, where a nurse will review the motivation and say, no, well, you can't use that and you can't use it for that amount of time. And to, I think, have a private infectious diseases speciality recognized as trumping the decision-making ability of a medical officer or nurse on the other end of the line, and understanding that we've got a little bit more insight into it and that they don't really need to read through our motivations and decisions, that they can accept our decisions as coming from something with a bit more education behind it. And then, like it was mentioned by Jeremy, the compensation for an infectious diseases specialist is not great and is about the same as what a general physician is able to charge. Our consultations are longer, we generate more paperwork, we have a lot more motivations to write, and we have lots of explaining and counseling of our patients to do. And so it is a factor in people not wanting to work in private because there's no procedure or extra things which one can really do to make money. So the kind of things which I would think we need to focus on in the private sector, just in closing, is education and trying to help our colleagues understand the value of getting an infectious disease consult, to engage with the medical aides, to try and get them to understand that we're a little bit more educated and have a bit more insight than a general physician, market and advertise ourselves to the private hospital groups and get ourselves involved in trying to get them to compensate and use us. And then lastly, to support the academic and state centers. Thank you.
Kim, that was fantastic. Thanks very much indeed. A really important view from the private side, and clearly a broken finance model, which is not unique to ID, but to try and attract infectious diseases specialists in hospitals and posts within hospitals. Clearly there needs to be a hard look at this and discussion to be thrashed out with medical aides and hospitals. Great opportunities also, of course, for training of ID specialists to perhaps spend some time with private colleagues, and that I'm sure we'll come on to. So we've got two further speakers who are both going to give us 5 minutes of their views, and it's a delight to welcome Lauren Richards to give us a trainee's perspective. And Lauren, if you're going to have 13 slides, you're going to need to speak rapidly, because we need to limit it to about 5 to 6 minutes. But looking forward to your views. Yeah. Thanks, Lauren.
It comes out as 2 slides in total, but okay. Good afternoon. I'm Lauren Richards, and I'm the fellow currently at Helen Joseph Hospital, which is affiliated with Wits. And so this is my perspective. I just wanted to lay down a disclaimer that it's my personal view and may not apply to the other fellows, although I did reach out to them. I didn't get any feedback. It may have been a bit late notice. So I'm going to start off with the challenges I think we face in recruiting and retaining future ID specialists. So I think a lot of this stuff has actually been mentioned before, but the first one is future revenue. So when it comes to deciding on a subspecialty, one's future revenue may be a deterring factor when it comes to the specialization of ID. The remuneration is lower than other subspecialties, and as said before, there aren't procedures that could boost the income, and I think this can dissuade potential candidates. So there's a perception of a limited patient profile before training or registrars have kind of rotated through infectious diseases. And often people ask me why I only want to see patients with HIV and TB. And so I think that the perception is that we see a very limited patient profile, and that it could be monotonous. Although obviously TB and HIV make up a large portion of what we do see, we also see patients with an array of other diseases with complications that require investigation and extensive thought on their treatment. Our patients are incredibly interesting, and each day brings new patients with new challenges. So the third challenge would be buy-in from other departments. So other departments may see ID services as an interference rather than assistance in their patient's care. And this can be really hard, not being recognized for the work that you're trying to do. I think this is particularly in unsolicited consults. So I'm not sure if this happens at other hospitals, but we are alerted by microbiology often as to patients, and will then go and see them. So lastly, on the challenges side, I think that maintaining and ensuring ongoing mentorship and teaching can sometimes be overlooked, and especially in a busy department with limited staff. But having a mentor or multiple mentors really encourages fellows to be more interested, and it provides appeal for potential fellows. I think that we should be paying particular attention to maintaining both of these things. So after discussing the challenges, I ultimately think that the future is really bright. And the reasons for my optimism include that I think that ID is an incredibly important specialty. I think that ultimately we all want to feel that we're making a difference in a positive way. We provide an essential service and care to our patients, and despite the perceptions from other departments, we are really important. Antibiotic resistance is only increasing. There are always going to be immunocompromised patients that need specialist care. We have knowledge in uncommon or highly infectious diseases, and we can assist in public health and policy. So I think it's only getting more exciting. There's always something new. We have new diagnostic tools, we have new therapies being developed, there's new understandings of diseases and how they impact the human body. There are emerging and re-emerging diseases. Case in point, it's the SARS-CoV-2 virus. So we have exposure to tropical and foreign infectious diseases. So aside from our own tropical diseases, South Africa has a large number of travelers, especially coming from the rest of Africa, like Kim said. These bring potential pathogens that are not endemic to South Africa, which I think from an ID specialist point of view is very exciting. We have clinical diversity, so we aren't limited to one organ or specialty. So for example, we'll see surgical, medical, psychiatric, gynae, inpatients and outpatients. And so you can take lots of avenues once specialized. You can stay in clinical medicine, do research, or even go into public health. And lastly, I feel that anyone joining the ID department is joining a community that really loves their job. I found that ID specialists really do enjoy their work, and being surrounded by that improves your work experience and just makes you a happier person, I think, generally. And that concludes my perception of the future of ID. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk.
Thanks very much, Lauren. Lovely cartoon to end, and really, really important points. And I think one of them particularly resonates for any of us, however long we've been in ID in South Africa. One of the issues is this perception of the limitation of ID to HIV and TB, and it's something that we really need to think about very closely as we try and motivate going forward this continuous struggle to be heard in other areas. Delighted to welcome my colleague Sipho from across the corridor, who's going to give us more food for thought about how we need to reconstruct. Sipho.
Thank you, Mark, and thank you, colleagues. So I'm just going to share with you some of the thoughts I have about this concept of deconstruction to reconstruct. So if ID is to have a future in this country, then I think a serious conversation as we're having today needs to be had about the future that we seek to construct. And one of the things I want to put to you all is that if there's a serious need to craft a future in ID, then perhaps deconstruction is necessary so that we are able to construct a future that is not only possible but attainable. Of course, there needs to be a clear understanding of what this future we're seeking to craft. So here I'll just share a few slides of my thoughts on perhaps assisting us with this conversation. And obviously mine are not exhaustive, and so I would suggest that other people do have different views. But I think just to say that deconstruction as a philosophical construct was described in 1960 by Derrida, and it's basically a construct that assists one in critically assessing institutions. So I think for us in infectious diseases, one of the questions would be, given the challenges we're having, do we need to think about issues that we might need to deconstruct? And these may be important to try to demystify the speciality. So for example, are there any myths about what the speciality of ID entails? Some, as previously mentioned, people think it's just TB and HIV and nothing else. And of course, there may be a historical context to infectious diseases, both within our country and obviously globally, and the history that the specialty entails. So, for example, is ID a continuation of tropical medicine? And I put tropical medicine here because if you do remember, the beginnings of tropical medicine was an effort to keep colonial tropic. So do we continually have that baggage? Do we need to address that or not? The other issue may be, do we have a crisis of perception? How is our specialty viewed? And do we need to address that perception? And I think once, if they either need to deconstruct, of course, and once we understand that, then there is a possibility of reconstruction. And this slide, just to share with you, is one in which Global Health, in their publication, I think just recently published, looking at their specialty and the challenges that the specialty has between its relationship between the global South and the global North. And this group of 13 public health or global health researchers and teachers outlined some of the challenges and perspectives they have in addressing some of the asymmetries that are prevalent in their field. And of course, the figure here illustrates that every grouping has its own internal power hierarchies and intersectional systemic disadvantages. And obviously, these may relate to race, caste, class, ethnicity, gender, or religion. But they are not, and they are important to recognize so that they can be addressed. And I would contend that some of these may exist in infectious diseases, and we need to understand them so that we can address them and attract the people that we want to attract. This is just another example by the clinical microbiology from the US last year, where in their editorial, they made a commitment to address some of the issues they had in microbiology. And this was obviously in response to Black Lives Matter in the US and how to address some of the diversity issues within microbiology and systemic racism that is prevalent in the US. I've just outlined some of the commitments and undertakings they decided to undertake to try and help within the microbiology field in the US. And obviously one of the issues was how to get more diverse opinion and voices and viewpoints within microbiology in the US. This one is just from the Infectious Disease Society of America, which Jeremy kindly highlighted in terms of the challenges that they face and how they would, some of the steps they would need to take to address or reinvigorate interest in ID in the US. And one of the things that comes out is how do you get reimbursement to be recognized for infectious diseases in the US, especially recognizing that it's a cognitive specialty and that it maybe needs to be remunerated differently compared to, let's say, general physician. So I think for us, importantly, and for the conversation is, if we are to recognize some of the things that we need to deconstruct, how then do we reconstruct? And I think some of the things we have to think about is, who are we trying to attract to the ID specialty? Are they groups who are underrepresented? And is it females in particular? How do we ensure that the barriers females entail are overcome? Do we need to reframe the specialty in terms of its importance, and how do we do that given the local and global context in which we live? Some issues have been highlighted in terms of career pathing in ID, the role of mentorship models, and of course, all these opportunities that some people have highlighted. So in conclusion, I think there's some reform that we need to do, and we just need to understand some of the barriers that are within our specialty. understand how they operate, and then begin to deconstruct them so that we can get the traction that we need to build the specialty in the country. Obviously, the COVID-19 pandemic has really highlighted the importance of infectious diseases. And again, I think the future that we need to craft needs to be such a way that we can move beyond some of these tick box exercises, but through real impact, so that the specialty grows, we get the numbers that we need, and grow the specialty. Thank you. That was
fantastic, Sipho. Thanks very much indeed. So what I'd like to do is to ask all the speakers to just put on their videos, please, so that we can see you. If colleagues would like to ask questions, could you please raise your hand? There's a raise hand function on the reactions button at the bottom, and we'll have a discussion now. I do want to pose one specific question to the panel, but I'm going to let's start off the discussion with grandmother of ID, Lucille.
So thanks very much, Mark. Thanks for putting this together, and great presentations. So if I look back 16 years ago, when we had the a big fight to get the ID registered as a subspecialty, a big issue remains 16 years later. We're still trying to sell the value and importance of ID to medical aids, hospital groups, colleagues, public health people, young colleagues. And I would have thought that COVID would have been the best example of where we could move it forward. But if you ask people, what is the specialty that stood out during COVID, they'll say epidemiologists. So yeah, I think we've moved forward lots, but that is still the biggest problem.
Thank you, Lucille. While people are determining how to put their hands up, I'm going to actually take that idea forward, and also, I mean, just thank Sipho, obviously, for putting a philosophical construct onto framing this, and also, you know, the idea, as Lucille has put, that COVID is a watershed moment. So you're right, a lot of people associated COVID with epidemiologists, but they also associate it with public health. So how do you combine infectious diseases and public health and make a case to the government, to the minister and to the DG and to others for what the country needs? So one of the options, and I would be interested in the panel's thoughts about this, is to highlight to the government that there is a lack in 4 out of 5 provinces of any infectious diseases specialist who, as we've heard, has a lot of roles, including outbreak and pandemic response. And if one trained those specialists in public health as well by doing an MPH at the same time, that would basically, well, particularly may prepare the country and certain areas of the country for future pandemics and future infectious diseases challenges. So there aren't any hands up at the moment. Perhaps I could ask even just the panel to perhaps think about, if you were standing in front of the DG and the minister to make a case for how you're going to increase ID specialists, how would you do that? So Halima.
I mean, I would first point out that during this current COVID pandemic, there was no ID specialists in a lot of hospitals, and what few there were already quite stretched in terms of service provision, planning, services, and public health preventions. But I think we also need to highlight that in my setting, where we don't have public health specialists, I mean, it's a tertiary hospital that's away from a center, I had to also do a lot of the public health infection control, prevention, intervention. So if you have a infectious diseases specialist, I agree with you that they could serve multiple roles, but I don't think you just need one. I think where I'm alone, and essentially if you can't take leave, you can't do anything else. So during a pandemic, you need more than one. So that's the other point we need to make, that just having one all over the place is not sufficient. You need more than one that has multiple uh, sort of abilities to work across public health and infectious diseases, infection control and prevention. And it would have, if we had these individuals already in the different provinces, I think it would have went a long way in terms of preventing lots of the bad outcomes we had
Okay.
with COVID-19.
Okay.
Thanks.
So you're going to be standing in front of him soon. So we need to address those issues. Thank you. Jeremy, you're next up in front of Honourable Minister.
Thanks. So I think that, as you say, the roles in terms of public health and in terms of epidemiology can be part of ID. So, for example, if you said to the government, what I want you to do is to sponsor in every province 2 posts, let's just start with 2, and that will obviously increase with time as people progress, which you're going to specialize in ID. And then at the end of that, we will sponsor you to do an MPH. Because I don't think you could do it during, maybe you could in exceptional cases, but I think it's a tough deal. But and then we want you, while you're doing your MPH or after you've got your MPH, to work and lead public health in the province. It's a little bit like a bursary in many, in other things where they would pay for this in expectation that you would give, say, 5 years back or whatever it is in that system. And I think then you start to actually increase the stock. It's only solving the problem in terms of those specific issues, those public health issues or AMS issues and that. But I think it's a really good start. And I think that could be a model where, you just got to, if you're in front of the health minister, you have to shake him by the shoulder and say, listen, you have no idea how cost effective this is. This is the best money you'll ever put down in terms of getting bang for your buck. So I think that's a really good way of doing it, but it's only solving some of the issues though. Yeah.
Okay.
Thanks.
No, thanks so much. Gary, I see your hand. I'm going to come to you in a minute, but I'm going to ask Kim, rather than going in front of the minister to say how you're going to train more people, what are you going to say to the minister to try and ensure that you get more private practitioners in for ID? And are there models, do you think, that could work between private hospital groups, medical aids and the public system? Could you have shared posts?
Yeah, definitely, Mark. So first of all, I think one of the ways that one could convince the minister that we need to do it is to show them the numbers. How many HIV positive people need treatment? How many TB? What are the COVID numbers? And similarly, the other infections. And then show them, for these numbers, we've got 30 ID specialists in the country or whatever it is, versus something like endocrinology, where yes, we do have plenty of diabetics, but it's nowhere near the kind of numbers that we're dealing with. And what we've got a similar number of endocrinologists in the country for maybe 1/10 the number of patients with these diseases. So either they need to cut the other specialities and not give posts for those, or they need to increase our numbers, and it makes sense that they need to increase our numbers. From a private point of view, the way we can justify it is to share some of the public load. And I think that the numbers definitely mean that that is something we're going to have to do, whether it's in an academic setting with a training or whether it's helping out, doing the opposite RWAPs in the public sector, that you go and do a clinic once a month or once a week or something like that. And interesting way for private people to keep in touch with what's going on in the public sector.
Thanks very much. That's great, and I think there does need to be some further, hard discussions now with the public, with private and public partnerships, and with the medical aids. It was interesting that they were particularly interested in the OPAT model from last week, but we need to get to highlight how real the issues are for inpatients and for the service in general. Lauren, would you be excited about being a public health and ID specialist, subspecialist?
So when you said maybe adding public health to the specialty, I did think, oh my goodness, I don't know if I can add that to I mean, yeah, so I think I would have to probably get more information on it, but maybe afterwards, or yeah, like at the same time, I don't know, it just seems like to me at the moment like quite a lot.
Okay, that's need to bear that in mind. And so lastly, SIPO, what you know, the other model, of course, and there's a variety of models that you could put forward to them. The one is this issue about what the country needs in terms of, you know, people who can deal not just with our everyday infections, but what we have just been through with COVID and what's to come. The other option, perhaps SIPO, I wondered of your thoughts, you know, what about talking with the universities and making ID training with PhDs so that you are then training clinician scientists for the future, the research side of things. And Gary and Lucille, I'm going to come to you now. But SIPO, what do you think?
Yeah, look, no, I think those are interesting propositions, Mark. But maybe let me just be a bit more controversial. I think, you know, in trying to demystify this, ID is not public health, and public health is not ID. In the same way that, I mean, there is an overlap, but I think we need to be clear, because I think if you're trying to speak to some of the policymakers, one of the things you're trying to say is the value proposition of ID. And if you look at the OPAT lecture yesterday, there was certainly a value proposition from ID leading a service like that. We know that AMS as a service has a good value proposition. There's enough literature and data to show the value and input of the infectious diseases. There's also data about the contribution of infectious diseases in patients with Staph aureus bacteremia, where the value, you know, so there's an economic case for infectious diseases. And I think we haven't made that that argument quite clearly enough and distinctly from the others. So I think public health and epidemiologists have made their cases to policymakers of their value proposition, and that's what we need to do. So in answering your question, yes, there are different models to which we can add to this, but I think at the core of this is the value proposition. And I think we've got enough data now to show the value proposition of ID as a standalone subspecialty and its contribution.
Thanks very much, and I'm happy for you to be controversial. And although I agree, public health doesn't equal ID, particularly, and the opposite is true too. An ID specialist with public health knowledge and background is a formidable character, so, and has possibilities. Gary, as one of the founders of ID in South Africa, be interested in your thoughts.
Yeah, I've got to rush to another talk. I completely agree with SIPO. I think if people want to do an MPH, that's great. It'll round you off as an individual and make you a better researcher. But I think to flog that as an idea is completely wrong. This is subspecialist training. You don't want to create a subspecialist who's also a specialist in public health. So I don't think that that's the way to go. I do think that the training should emphasize strong infectious disease epi as part of the training, but I don't think you need an MPH. So that's my word. I completely agree with SIPO. There's enough in the specialty, in the subspecialty, to make the case for the state, for private sector.
Yeah.
Bye, everybody. I really enjoyed the session.
Thanks, Gary. But I think just to point out that we've been trying to make the case for 15 years and we haven't done brilliantly so far. So, you know, what does the government need? And that's also, you know, it's like a bit like grantsmanship. You have to understand what the funders want as well as what we want. So I think these are all open. These are all open to be shot down, but also open to discussion. Lucille.
Yeah, so it is a clinical specialty, but I think you shouldn't ignore the public health aspects of these infectious diseases. And I think if you do broaden an infectious disease specialist's scope, interest, and activity to include the public health components of it, I think you do broaden the attractiveness to people you're trying to interest in it. And I've done ID public health for a long time now. I'm not a public health specialist, but I don't think you should be divorcing the one completely from the other. And I think it should be included in the ID training.
Thanks very much. Lucilla, thanks, Lucilla. I'd also like to get Dave, I mean, perhaps a view from a difficult province like the Eastern Cape. I mean, Dave, what are your thoughts on what you've heard today? Dave Stead.
Hi everyone. Thanks. That's been really good. So I mean, it's interesting in the Eastern Cape. I don't think John Black, I haven't seen him on, but John. So we've got 2 adult ID specialists, myself and John, and 2 pediatric ID doctors, all in the state sector. And John's managed to get accredited as a training site, I think, for about 2 years, but hasn't had any applicants. And I think obviously we are getting more successful at training FCPs, at training physicians, and they're mostly going into private fairly quickly. Not many of them are subspecializing, and I think definitely the sort of attractiveness of the of the subspecialty is a key factor, and economics are a big thing, I think, for trainees from the Eastern Cape. So there's a really important to think through, and selling ID. I mean, it tends to be people that are, we're quite a rare breed of people that are really passionate and keen to make a difference, that tend to go into ID, and of FCP graduates, I think that's a fairly small number, but I think there are some that probably could be great ID specialists that maybe just haven't had a good exposure, or we haven't been selling the discipline. I think thinking about the role in the private sector is key as well, and there isn't much incentive to be an ID specialist in private as opposed to just being a general physician. Obviously 2 years of training is quite an undertaking, and so there needs to be a good incentive, which I don't think there is really at the moment. Yeah, on the I mean, I think the public health is key. I think it would be great if we could strengthen that. I agree that, I mean, it's always a danger if you kind of over train someone, you're going to start de-skilling clinically, if you're doing a whole MPH post ID. So probably, I don't think I mean, that maybe that for some who are going to go in the more public health direction, that'll be good. But I think definitely Gary's points, including ID EPI as part of the 2 years, whether that time needs to be extended a little bit to do that justice, and that's something that could be looked at. But I think definitely, we've all been especially with COVID, sort of pushed into, having to, interact with high levels of governments and planning and things that we weren't necessarily trained for. And that's some of us have maybe been a bit underprepared for, and you learn on the job. But
Brilliant. I mean, just to be clear, my suggestion was actually to integrate MPH and ID subspecialty training at the same time. So you make it a 3-year training as a minimum. We do ours in 2 years ID, and then you add an extra year. And during that time, you do the MPH training. That would be my suggestion. But we've got a comment from Helen, and then from Lauren. And I do appreciate, sorry, that I know we're just over the hour, and I do appreciate that some people will need to go. If those of you who would like to stay for another 5-10 minutes max, we'll continue the discussion. So Helen.
Hi Mark, and hi everybody, and thanks for inviting us and including the private sector, because we're always regarded a little bit as the black sheep kind of in ID. And I must say the biggest learning curve and the steepest that I've experienced in my entire medical career has been in the private sector. And the reason is the diversity. I have not had that exposure in at Trelliscure, Mark, or with Yankee at Tygerberg for that matter, or in any other secondary level hospital. And it's exactly as Jeremy outlined, we have so many, we use advanced immunosuppressive agents, TNF-alpha inhibitors, etc. There's heme oncology, and we specialize quite sophisticated. Well, there are doctors that practice quite sophisticated medicine here. We have LVADs, those things, and device-associated infections are prominent. And it's been a challenge getting people to refer. It's been absolutely, we are under-recognized still. The older I mean, we need to target all the consultants, surgical groups, cardiothoracic surgeons in particular. They're celestial beings. We need to talk to them, you know. So that is something in the academic sector, if we can just approach that to make it almost mandatory to make us part of those teams. And often, of course, our advice is disregarded, as Kim said. Now, I think the way I would sell it to the minister, your biggest threat is going to be your gram-negative pan-resistant infections. Our hospital is crawling with this. We have this huge rehabilitation units next door that receives patients from across all the facilities in the Western Cape. And that is where it's a cesspit, it's a slime pit. That's where our CREs, OXA40 AIDS and NDMs live and transfer. And these people have spinal injuries. They need to be moved. You can't isolate them properly. And it's just, and they become sick. They get bladder infections, etc. They come across to us. So the biggest threat is going to be your antibiotic usage. And to give you an example, a course of Keftas avibactam in the private sector for 7 days with normal renal function costs you close to 100,000 rand. And the biggest mortality in patients, long-stay COVIDs on ventilators, they got pan-resistant gram-negative bacterial infections. If you speak to Jennifer Kutsia, that's exactly what happened in Joburg. These patients died of pan-resistant gram-negatives. And people were pushing in Keftas Avi, and I wouldn't be surprised if Johannesburg Gauteng used the global supply of Keftas Avi in a very short period of time. So again, we can be controlling that. So somehow we need the legislation, Mark, if we can put that in, at the hospital groups, either hospital groups or the funders, they must pay us for AMS. I get blasted if I approach somebody who's treating, I had a medical officer write up Keftas avibactam in our rehab unit. Luckily, the pharmacy alerts me. I've got really close ties with our pharmacists, and I just stepped in, and the medical officer wrote up the drug in a patient that is pre-terminal. You know, so there is so much wastage, and that would be a huge, huge help, and it would make us all feel better and more valued. And that's the only thing. So legislation, look at that. Warn them about the cost and the problem that is to come. It's going to spill over into your sector, and basically it will affect all other specialities: transplant, oncology, specialized surgeries, colorectal surgeries, all of that. If we're all colonized with these pan-resistant organisms, you have to close your heme oncology units. You can't do transplantation medicine. It's all wasted. So that is our biggest. I would focus on that to a large part. Thanks, Mark.
Thanks, Helen, and I'm sure you'll be a very important voice in trying to make these recommendations to the Department of Health. Lauren?
I just wanted to highlight that the exposure of ID to kind of registrars or medical registrars, I definitely would. I had no idea what ID was about when I was a registrar, and I definitely wouldn't have gone into it had I not rotated through it as a registrar. So, I mean, I don't know if that's possible. Obviously, I don't know if every training facility has every FCP training facility has an ID department, but that's definitely, it's the way I was exposed and the only way that I was ever going to specialize in ID. And so I just wanted to emphasize that.
Well, thanks very much. So, and I quite agree. So we are coming, we are over 10 minutes over time. There are colleagues on the call from different areas obviously of the country, which we haven't heard from. There's also, this has been very much a discussion about adult infectious diseases. I see Gary Rubinson's on the call, as a pediatric infectious diseases specialist. I'm guessing, Gary, that this is very similar in the pediatric sphere. Are there any differences, and are there any differences that you would take to motivate for an expansion of pediatric ID? Before, just to get your thoughts before I come on to Kim to end up.
Welcome. Thanks to the panel for the talks. No, I think the issues in pediatric ID are identical to those that have been raised here. We, like in many subspecialties, are classically a couple of years behind our adult colleagues. So I think numbers-wise and training-wise, our programs are a little less developed, and we have fewer around. I mean, obviously that does vary across geographical areas. Not directly answer your question, but just something to add to the discussion. Certainly over the last 5 or 10 years or so, we in PEDS ID have developed a much closer relationship with our adult ID colleagues. And I think I certainly can speak from the PEDS side, and it certainly has added to our experience and our ability to train our subspecialty trainees. And I suspect the same is true in the other direction, is that having us involved and having kind of some collaborative and shared areas has improved the exposure of adult ID trainees. And while we don't have the perfect model, I just do think that should be part of both adults and PEDS ID training programs, is to have some level of integration and co-exposure between the two areas.
Right. No,
and I've really heard it. Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
No, please go ahead.
No, I was just going to really add that to this, that point to this discussion, because it hasn't been made yet.
No, thanks very much. Important. And yes, cross-pollination and learning between the two is important. Perhaps I might also take an opportunity. So, Peter Raubenheimer, from an internal medicine point of view, is there a role for ID in South Africa? How would you motivate?
Hi, Mark.
Hi, Peter.
Am I now the outsider? Yeah.
No,
I think. I mean, the challenge is obviously not unique to ID. I mean, I think it's a challenge of a newer specialty, and it's a challenge of a consulting specialty, which is the same across the world, I think. But I mean, I think. I mean, I do think the selling point for ID, other than at subspecialty level, which is kind of self-evident, really. I'm not really sure why that's still a discussion from a clinical point of view, is the non-patient care activities. And I mean, it's antimicrobial stewardship, it's leaders of infection control programs, it's, you mentioned public health, occupational health, minimizing exposure of healthcare workers and healthcare worker well-being, etc. And all those things are in theory remunerable outside of clinical service. So for me, that might be the hook for ID as a specialty. It might, of course, attract a different kind of specialist who rather than a clinician. So one has to think about that, whether that's a single specialty or something different. But yeah, I think the challenges are difficult.
Thanks, Peter. I think it's important. We're all sort of the choir on the call, and it's important to have people, who aren't ID specialists to give some perspective. And I think the selling points, the issue is, if we're going to build ID and a future for ID, we need to understand, what we can leverage and how we expand. Okay, so I'm going to actually, Kim, you're up next, but I'm going to just give each panelist literally a minute to sum up and to give any further points where they think this should be going. So, Kim.
Okay, thank you, Mark, and thanks everybody. So what I wanted to say was, we've seen now with this discussion that there's a whole lot of the provinces that don't have a single ID specialist, never mind in private, not any in government. And an ID specialist is pretty useless without an excellent microbiologist and laboratory service at the other end. And many of these provinces without ID specialists also don't have functioning labs. Joburg has to go to do outreach on the periphery. And although it's still in Gauteng, some of these hospitals, the lab services are absolutely terrible. And when an infectious diseases specialist fellow goes and works in one of these peripheral hospitals, they're not even able to use their ID training to help the people in that place, simply because the support services are terrible. So I think that's another aspect which makes our lives even more difficult, and another point to focus on, that we, unlike many other specialities, cannot work alone.
That's a very well made point, Kim. Thank you. Jeremy?
Thanks, Mark. So I think most of the points have been very well made and are really well appreciated. And just two things. One is, again, just to punt, I think that we need to make sure undergraduates get the exposure to this in a very positive manner that we can. We haven't talked much about it today, but again, I think it would help a lot. I think there's some evidence to suggest this again, because this is one of the ways to improve it, is to talk it like this with these sort of people in the room again. And I think we've had a lot of good thoughts today and a lot of things to mull over. So thank you. You're muted, man.
Sorry, Halima. Thanks, Jeremy. I agree. Halima.
Yes, thank you, Mark. Thanks for organizing, and thank you everybody for your valuable input. So for me, I would think that somebody made a suggestion on the chat line that we need to create a value proposition. So when we present the value of ID, we need a value proposition. And I agree with Kim, we have to include the sort of team approach, because you can't just put an ID specialist somewhere without the complementary services. And I think that would be the way forward. And I think what SIPO sort of presented, we need to give some thought on how we could sort of better sort of deconstruct ID to get sort of a plan on how to address each of the issues that he highlighted, because I think that may be part of the proposition going forward. Thanks.
No, thanks very much. I'm going to ask Sipa, and then as we have the bright future of ID going last. Sipa?
Yeah, no, thanks, Mark. Yeah, so I think this conversation has been very good. I think it's also quite clear that we probably need to have a conversation about how we highlight ID as a cognitive specialty, and therefore begin conversations about how we get remunerated if we're in the public or private space. I think the attraction of the specialty is there, but I think what we need to do more is to show what various people are doing within ID, you know, so that people can see the different paths that they can take within ID as well. And having more platforms like this, talking, sharing is one way of doing that. Thanks.
Thank you. No, thanks, Sipa. Thanks for your thoughts. Lauren.
I think it's been incredibly valuable to have this discussion, but you know, I think we've mostly discussed our challenges, and it can get a bit kind of daunting and a bit kind of depressing sometimes. And I want to say that most of the trainees and people who do want to do ID are very passionate about it. I mean, yeah, when we were at the special pathogens course, all the fellows I've kind of chatted to and know, we all really love doing this. And I think that if we can try and spread how exciting and how much we love what we're doing, that's hopefully will become infectious.
Thanks very much indeed. And so I'd really like to